Hello and welcome to my game room. Today I'll take you on an in-depth guided tour of my space. I've been collecting for basically my entire life and I currently have a little over 1,000 games and 55 consoles. But first, let me quickly explain my origin story. My love for video games started Christmas of 1999 when I got my very first handheld, a Game Boy Color. I love to play my retro video game consoles on the TVs they were designed for. Here's one of my CRTs that most of my retro consoles are hooked up to. Up next is a custom hand-built console Cubby system. This unit holds all of my consoles that I play regularly. And the bottom shelf is great for miscellaneous storage. Here I've got a PlayStation Portal, all of my Sega Genesis games, a Sega Game Gear, a PSP, and Super Famicom games. And up top I've got a PlayStation 5 and my Nintendo Switch. And above that is a custom hand-built Nintendo 64 cartridge display. And so I don't have to fuss with cables in the back of TVs, I've got all of my consoles running through switchers. And on the right side of my console display, I've got a really cool Mass Effect helmet and ship display. Mass Effect is my favorite series of all time. I'm also a huge anime fan, which you'll see more of a little bit later in the video. For now, here's some really cool art from one of my favorite animes, Naruto. Continuing to the right is another CRT. This set is pretty much dedicated to the original Nintendo. On top and mostly just for display is Rob the Robot. He looks cool on display, but I gotta say the handful of games that he was made for are pretty terrible. And speaking of things that have terrible games, here is the really cool Nintendo Power Glove. The next section is all about Pokémon. Here we have a framed Nintendo Power poster that was advertising for the first game. And just below that is a Gen 1 through 3 complete in box Japanese Pokémon set. I have lots of Japanese stuff in my collection and I think the box art looks really cool. And to complement the Japanese set, I've also got the complete Gen 1 through 3 complete in box North American set. I acquired all of these in the span of 2 days, and let's just say it was the single most expensive purchase I've ever made for the game room. But like I said, Pokemon is the single most influential series in my life, so this was an expense that I felt was really justified. And on top of the Tower of Pokemon, I've got some really cool display pieces. I recently completed this Mario and Yoshi Lego set, and just to the left of that is a really cool Samus statue. Speaking of Samus, let's move to the left and check out the Metroid display. The Metroid stuff gets its own display because it's one of my favorite series of all time. There is a ton of Metroid history packed onto these two shelves. And just to the left of that, we've got a display for another favorite series of mine, The Legend of Zelda. Here's a really cool life-size replica of the Master Sword. It's all metal and leather. And on the right of the display is another all-metal life-size replica, this time of the Hylian shield. And in the center of this display are 3 shelves that house pretty much the entire history of the Zelda franchise. We have a very thorough mix of complete-in-box North American and Japanese games. We've also got some really cool amiibos and other miscellaneous collectibles. Next up is this rotating tower which houses over 400 PlayStation and Xbox games. If you can't find a game that you'd want to play on this shelf, well, I just don't know what to tell you. Continuing to the right, we've got a third CRT TV. This one is used primarily as my Sega Genesis station. And as the poster child for the Genesis, Sonic the Hedgehog displays just make sense. Up next is a really cool custom World of Nintendo display along with 5 framed Nintendo Power posters. And now on to the main focal point of the game room. Here we have a massive custom floor-to-ceiling Nintendo shelf. The top two shelves focus on the original Nintendo and Super Nintendo. I've got a good mix of consoles, collectibles, and games, both loose and complete in box. The third shelf houses most of my complete in box Super Famicom, Nintendo 64, and Japanese Nintendo 64 games. Shelf number 4 contains some GameCubes and some really cool Nintendo 64 consoles. We've got the full Funtastic N64 set as well as some really cool Japanese variants. Shelf number 5 contains the earlier era of handheld gaming from Nintendo. We've got the original Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. Oh yeah, and just because it looks really cool, we've also got this NES Lego set. Shelf number 6 is also dedicated to Nintendo handhelds. On this shelf we've got a range of DS and 3DS games and consoles. And shelf number 7 is all of my GameCube, Wii, and Wii U titles. And the last shelf houses all of my Nintendo Switch games, a really cool Zelda Nintendo Switch, and all of my literature. I did mention earlier that I'm a huge anime fan. While the vast majority of my room is dedicated specifically to video games, I can't not mention my anime shelf. These shelves house the manga for Inuyasha, Dragon Ball Z, Naruto, and Bleach. Also on display are some really cool anime Funko Pops. And in this shadow box are the Japanese Volume 1 of Bleach and Naruto. Now that you've seen my entire game room, I'm sure you're wondering what my most expensive video game is. If we're talking loose games, meaning those not in a box, it's Earthbound for the Super Nintendo. This game comes in roughly around $350. The next two most expensive loose games in my collection are right next to it. We've got Dracula X, which is a Castlevania title, and Chrono Trigger. If we're talking most expensive boxed video games, then that one is Pokémon Crystal. This one comes in around $580. The second most expensive boxed game in my collection is a close second. It's Pokémon Emerald, coming in around $550. But in my entire collection, my most valuable item is no doubt my Game Boy that I got for Christmas of 1999. I'm not talking about monetary value though. This is the very same Game Boy I got Christmas of 1999, and that started it all. Thanks for hanging out with me. I hope you enjoyed the game room tour, and I'll see you on the next video.